Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast. And on today's episode, we have an important guest and an important episode. We're going to be speaking with Nimrod Bar-Am, Senior Lecturer of Logic and Rhetoric at Sapir College in Israel. Nimrod, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
So today we're going to speak about Joseph Agassi, who sadly died a few weeks ago. And I've done a couple of podcasts with him recently on the podcast, which I'll link below. But I know you knew him very well and are a close colleague of his. And I might open the floor up to you and get you to explain just briefly who was Joseph Agassi and how did you know him?
Well, that's really almost impossible to do. To sum up, he was, I guess, first and foremost, an incredible person. Not just a scholar or a thinker or anything like that. He was for an incredible amount of people a sage. Mm-hmm. Whom they consulted on many questions of intellectual and not so intellectual character. And he was an extremely impressive character. He was completely and totally dedicated to his work. And his work meant being in the service of people around him. So when he was writing in the service of readers, and he placed himself, I would say, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but I know quite a few people who tested him on this. Calling him at 4 a.m. in the morning just to see if he would answer, and he would, and he was immediately available. And if the question was solvable in a few sentences, he would solve it on the phone, and otherwise he would invite you in. And no matter when you called, how awkward it was, he would invite you in and sit with you until you got tired. And when you got tired, he had his time to go back to the computer and be in the service of others. It was the most inspiring human phenomenon that I have encountered, and I'm really grateful to have worked with him.
How did you first meet him? What was your relationship like?
Well, I met him actually by accident. I was doing my BA during my army service, which was illegal, but I did it anyway. And so I was very, very young, and I was considered very promising in my department. And I didn't know Agassi existed. And at the timetable of my studies, I needed a seminar to close my BA studies, and there was this seminar that fitted my schedule, and the people who consulted me about my studies, they all tried different awkward ways to prevent me from falling into this spider trap. It was a person to be, I mean, if you were an ambitious young academic, it was advisable that you would avoid him, because he was so anti-political. He was so straightforward and so honest and so critical and so intimate, that encounters with him were in the extremes. And I didn't think twice. I thought if everyone is attempting to block my way to see this phenomenon. I have to go about and see it. And so I sat in his seminar, and it was an awkward seminar. He didn't have an agenda. He didn't have a curriculum or syllabus. He just entered the room, asked for questions, and whatever the question was, it could have been what's the meaning of life, or what is the proper methodology of the exact sciences, or is logic certain, or whatever question popped, he would discuss it in full, serving all the historical answers to it, criticizing them, and giving you a bird's eye view of a whole philosophical field. It was so different than the step-by-step small studies that I was accustomed to, that it was a shock. And, one of the things it made me realize from the early start is how little I know, and how awkward I am when I try to perform this survey of general questions. And I also realized that this is what philosophy is all about. So I suddenly realized that I have to start again. And he was extremely available. That was the other thing that I already mentioned, but was a complete shock to me, because I was by then the assistant professor of one of the most powerful and influential professors in the humanities, who later became dean. And so I was recognized as someone with a philosophical future. But whenever I tried to meet this guy, he was postponing our meetings indefinitely, and usually sending me to read stuff which he never discussed with me. And with Agassi, it was always opposite. I met him at the corridor, and we started a conversation at noon, and it would end midnight at his home, you know. And during those hours, during those talks, I learned more history and philosophy and art and any subject which I was brave enough to discuss with him in depths that I couldn't imagine until then. So you could say I found a teacher. And then he invited me to be his research assistant, only cautioning me that if I do so, I will be unable to find a proper academic job. And of course, I didn't believe him. I was until then so successful that I really thought that by being excellent, you will be filtered into the system. But the fact is that his most excellent students are all either in the outskirts or parochial outskirts of the academic world, or completely outside it.
So why was Agassi considered so dangerous? I mean, he has an incredible resume behind him, incredible output of thought and publication. So what was it specifically about Agassi that worried so many people and made him so untouchable in certain circles?
This is a difficult question without serving. I think the not the academic world, but the humanities and the social sciences in this. So he was extremely critical of the defensive manners by which most of the people around these fields behave, both as groups and as individuals. And he was he believed that by being so critical, he is doing an important service. And it was a service that many people did not wish to listen to. And since he was so successful in what he did, he elicited panic. He was very, very good at what he did.
So all those topics that he was happy for people to lead him into and ask questions about, do you think you found them all personally very interesting, or do you think it was more a sense of duty? Because people like Popper certainly found certain questions uninteresting, or at least they said were uninteresting. But the sense from Agassi is he found it all very interesting.
This is an awkward temperamental difference between them both, because there is no doubt in my mind that both were perhaps the most talented people at reconstructing problems with their historical background and being critical about them. So there's the powers of reconstruction was unmatchable. But I think Popper was much more of a perfectionist. That he was preoccupied with formulating better ideas which he has already formulated, despite being extremely original. And most of the ideas that he had, I would say, did not even come to fruition because he was so preoccupied with doing better formulations of what he previously did and correcting it. And this made him a little impatient with things which came out of the box for him, out of the working table that he had set before him for what he wants to do and what he wants to achieve. And Agassi was much freer in this sense, and much more patient to even low-level conversations, and even embarrassingly low-level interlocutors. He was somehow indistinguishing between the extremely refined and full of minute details conversation of the expert, and the very, very blunt and unsophisticated questionnaire. And he would give both of them the same amount of attention, almost like an Asperger. You know, he would not care if his interlocutor was an expert or a novice. And in this, he was very special. I believe Popper would lose patience. I mean, I have heard descriptions of him losing his temper just by students not offering ideas which are criticizable, for example. And Agassi would painstakingly explain that this is required. And was very patient about it, and at least I know he was different before, in the years before I met him, and much more wild and Popperian-like in his behavior. But the last 30 years of his life, which I followed closely, where he was unbelievably tolerant to all people who came to speak with him.
Let's jump into the philosophy then, and we should start, I suppose, with that question and the great schism between Agassi and Popper around the role of metaphysics in science. And this is something you've written about yourself. So I might get to start just explaining how Popper saw the role of metaphysics and science, or perhaps how he saw the demarcation between the two. And then we can get into how Agassi saw things differently.
Sure, but before I jump into details, I want to say that Agassi also did a lot in the matter of the expanding critical rationalism and Popper's core ideas into places where Popper did not have time, or did not think of, or even did not like to expand his critical rationalism to. So Agassi brought about critical rationalism to ethics, for example, where Popper did not think much of ethics. And even famously refused to discuss ethics with Agassi.
Yeah.
Agassi wrote a book with Ian Jarvie about aesthetics. He wrote a few books, both with Yuda Fried and with Nathaniel Laor on psychiatry and the philosophy of diagnosis in medicine and general, and in psychiatry in particular. And he wrote quite a lot about education, about in all these fields he put into action, I would say, core ideas that he had learned from Popper, and which no Popperian before him attempted to implement into. So I would first say that he expanded critical rationalism considerably. Now, in metaphysics, it's one section in which I would say Popper's perfectionism, which I already mentioned, sort of backfired. As perfectionism often does, because he was reformulating and rephrasing ideas which he had. In some sense, also, when you read his biography, you cannot but have a sense that this is not a biography. This is an attempt to impose ideas which he slowly and painstakingly developed onto a child that couldn't have any notion about these developments. So in a sense, this uncomfortable image of a child that already knows what the old man would do is a characteristic, I would say, or a characteristic weakness of Popper's philosophy. And I say this with all the admiration that is possible for Popper. I regard him as the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, easily. So this perfectionism, when it comes to metaphysics, and this tendency to not only to reformulate and formulate and reformulate your ideas, but also to claim that your later formulations are but variations sometimes of earlier not so developed formulations, or even this backfired with respect to Popper's attitude to metaphysics. because it's easier to see that the early Popper is doing quite a lot of positivistic effort to set metaphysics aside, and being centered on demarcation between science and non-science. He clearly puts metaphysics outside the realm of science, and so in the what we call the wastebasket of pseudoscience, which of course includes many other fields such as mathematics or pure logic and astrology and so on. So and it's clear to anyone reading Popper that since the 50s, whether or not this came as a result of the meeting Agassi is perhaps debatable, because Agassi came to England in the August 52. So you can see that Popper is changing his views about metaphysics and allowing it an important guiding role in research, and doing quite a bit of effort in showing that you can be critical towards metaphysical views, and in this sense, he allows metaphysics into not science, of course, but the realm of the criticizable, let's say, and so rationally it can be discussed and. Perhaps even this is not clear again. Popper improved, and that's so. There's the early Popper who is quite positivistic toward metaphysics, not perhaps in that it's completely meaningless, but it's outside of science. And it's also not progressing. In 45, he still speaks about metaphysics as something, some activity that is not progressive. And this changes with the later Popper, of course, into something that you can call proto-science, that is criticizable. He obviously thinks that certain metaphysical outlooks are correct, such as realism or indeterminism, and some metaphysical outlooks are incorrect, and that you can argue your way about it. So that's Popper on metaphysics. With Agassi, things are far clearer in the sense that well before he met Popper, he was convinced that metaphysics is the starting point of every intellectual effort that you can think of, because this is the most abstract worldview that you come about into any kind of research with. And the critical rationalist work is that you start with these rudimentary abstractions and ideas, sometimes not always well formulated, sometimes unconscious, sometimes vague, but slowly by being critical, you make them clearer. And so Agassi really cared little about the distinction between the empirical science and the non-empirical metaphysical theory or system. And
did he maintain any ideas within his own philosophy about a demarcation? Did he twist it, or did he throw out the whole idea? So are some metaphysical ideas worthless and some not worthless?
He never understood why a demarcation should be sought to begin with. He called it the bouncer. As if science is a private club and you have to bounce theories outside because they are of low background. So his stress was so long as you are critical and self-critical and open to change your views, you can develop even astrology into full-fledged astronomy. It's all about how open you are to criticism. It's not, so there was little reason to distinguish between science and non-science. He would openly call certain metaphysical systems scientific, such as mechanism, and openly ridicule empirical silly generalizations, such as if you listen to everything I say, you will live forever, something like that. That's easily refutable, right? But it's bad science. So he never got the point of why we should, and I tend to agree with him on this. The idea of demarcation maybe had different sound to it when Einstein replaced Newton, and all of the scientists were looking for ways to distinguish between the extremely intelligent mistake that was Newton and the silly mistake, or as Russell would call it, the ravings of madmen. So the task of distinguishing the intelligent mistake and the non-intelligent mistake was seemed much more burning at those days than it is today, I think. So I can clearly see why Popper made such a stress, or have placed such a stress on this task early on, but I less understand why he celebrated the demarcation criterion as an achievement in the 60s, for example.
Is the distinction at all valuable for Agassi? So if metaphysics guides the science that we have, and then science criticizes
the differential distinction is how open you are to criticism. That's the most important thing. And of course, there's you could say that certain Agassi stressed the attitude of being critical, not the theory. The theory you can treat it critically, and so slowly turn it into an empirical testable idea. And any empirical theory you can defend, and Popper explained this as well. You can defend it indefinitely and therefore empty it of empirical content. So refutability, fallibility is never in the theory. It's always in the attitude which you practice. And once you get this idea, I think this changes philosophy completely. And this is what Agassi was doing in all those other fields as well. So,
what was Agassi's impact upon Popper? There's an interesting appendix that you highlight in one of your articles here, where you say that Popper he wrote something that was quite close to Agassi's position, at least the position that metaphysics are vitally important for.
Without mentioning the word metaphysics, yes.
Yes.
So again,
but you also mentioned in that at the time he wrote that, Agassi was his assistant. So do you think Agassi had an impact upon him, or?
I would conjecture that I would stipulate that his very dissertation, his dissertation was on the influence of metaphysical outlooks on the development of science. So he wrote about Faraday. Everybody used to ridicule Faraday's metaphysical system. But Agassi showed that it was a very serious and influential background to Faraday's discoveries. So I would say, on the one hand, Jarvis says it very, very beautifully in his comparison, that the very fact that Popper accepted Agassi as a student writing about the influence of metaphysics on science shows that Popper was much more refined in his view of the influence of metaphysics on science as he expressed himself in writing. Otherwise, he would tell Agassi to write about something else. But that undoubtedly Agassi's influence here is present, in that you can see Popper gradually developing respect towards metaphysics during the 50s.
Let's talk briefly about that historiography of science that Agassi is so famous for doing, and his highlighting of the metaphysics involved. So tell me about how he viewed the changes in history, because many people have ideas of certain metaphysical principles holding, like induction held for centuries and things like this. And Agassi looked back into these ideas and said, if you look at what they're actually doing, or the ideas they actually said, something very different. There's different metaphysics at play.
Yes, and I would first stress the fact that Agassi is either the first or one of the first few to write a historiography of science. I mean, there were histories of science, but the historiography of science, the question, how is the history of science influenced by the various methodological beliefs or metaphysical frameworks of the historian, is in putting that question on the table is one of Agassi's earliest contributions to our world. So the very project was revolutionary, and what Agassi first did was to show that the wrong belief of dogmatic historians that science is achieved by induction had completely twisted the histories of many of the histories of science of the previous century. So that's in that by showing that you could listen to what scientists do and compare it with what they believe they do, you could achieve a much more interesting and much sounder history of science. So this was, I believe, a great achievement.
looking at that work, and this is a very Popperian point of Agassi's, he seems to labor the fact that what these historians of science have been missing over the years is they're failing to look at the problems that these scientists were trying to solve, and they were running back with an existing metaphysics in their mind and trying to apply that.
So if you look at the Faraday system, for example, the historians which wrote the list of achievements of Faraday before Agassi, they all wrote that Faraday's discoveries were achieved despite of Faraday's metaphysical argument. And so none of them really listen to the facts. It's like you have a preconceived idea so strong that you don't see what's in front of you, you know. And so he was attempting to correct that.
Did he correct the record towards a more Popperian picture of the history of science, so away from empiricism and induction, and more towards these people being theoreticians?
Sure, yes. So he showed that the experimental results were the outcome of metaphysical outlooks, that the critical approach did the service in certain points in the history of science and so on. Yes, of course.
So that's I should ask at that point about a lasting contribution of Agassi's, and this seems to be something that he clearly did a better job than many other people out there. He's a wonderful popularizer, not just of science, but of the philosophy of science. It can be a dull subject for people from the outside looking in.
Yes.
But having read, I've got a few books in my bookshelf and read a few of his articles in preparation here. They are completely gripping reads, these books, including his dissertation, by the way.
Yes, he's such an able writer that you immediately get intimate with his voice, and you can. It's reading Agassi is much more intimate experience than most dull writers on the history of science or science. I completely agree. I'm thinking what you call a lasting. The idea that we begin with the general metaphysics, for example, that is such a huge breakthrough. I think I read in your blog, for example, the interesting interview with Hatyan Gadi, who attempts to correct Popper's idea of Bacon.
Yes,
and of Bacon's induction. Let's say. I agree that Bacon's methodology was much more sophisticated than presented in the early Popper. That goes without saying. But if you look at it at the level we are looking at now, you could clearly see that however sophisticated Bacon is, he is advancing a bottom-up methodology, in the sense that you observe the details, you make small manipulations. You don't know why you make the small manipulations, because you don't have a general idea. You are not allowed to. Bacon is against you coming with a preconception to research, right? So methodology is not coming with a preconception, and then arriving at the general outlook by looking at the details. In this sense, Popper's description is correct. And and Bacon is wrong, and Hatyangadi. And what Agassi would say is, as a matter of course, we come with a preconception. And Bacon is right that this preconception may be completely false. But by being critical, by comparing it with what we observe, by trying to fix it, by correcting it, so by we get a top-down approach, if you like, right? Or a dialogue between the top-down and the bottom-up, which is what I would call Agassi's methodology is. By an open dialogue between those levels, you get a far closer methodology to what scientists really do, and a much more proper description of how science advances. So this type of criticism that I'm sure Agassi would direct against Hatyangadi's interpretation is the sort of service that I think he was so skillful at doing. It's like he would observe someone doing something correct at a small scale. Hatyangadi's correction of a simplified conception of Bacon, to then go one level above that and show that still Bacon's methodology is completely on the wrong, since it allows it argues for a bottom-up approach, and then correct that approach completely by a far more sophisticated methodology. So he did this service many fields.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. Would it be fair to say that, just trying to put myself in Hatyangadi's shoes perhaps, that the way Bacon talks about collecting facts to criticize our views, and the idea is that we can often be blinkered to the real facts out there, that he certainly was an inductivist of a kind, but he was also perhaps a proto-Popperian in the sense of he was perhaps a proto-falsificationist of a sort.
On the low level he would, but on a higher level he was not a Popperian because he rejected altogether the idea that we come with a preconceived metaphysics to this is the idols, right? We do our best to rid of all the preconceptions that we have. So you see, on the small level, yes, but on a higher level, I would say that Bacon was not a Popperian at all, and that Greenbaum and Hatyangadi are wrong in this.
Let's talk about ethics. And you mentioned it earlier. I think this is fascinating. And I've been reading a lot about this in the last few weeks. And so let's start in an early place here. You mentioned that Popper didn't want to talk to Agassi about ethics, and Agassi developed some interesting thoughts after that. So basically, he has a very simple idea which has huge implications. And Agassi calls this at different times institutional individualism. I think at one point I read the phrase modified hedonism. So what does Agassi think about the individual and ethics and the important role of autonomy?
Well, I think these are two different fields. Institutional individualism has to do with what we count as a good explanation in the social science. That's I would say a bit of a different conversation. We can start it after talking about ethics. But what Agassi, in a few sentences, Agassi's ethics or philosophy, moral philosophy is that since criticism is the highest form of intellectual development that we can aspire to, we should aspire to an environment which encourages openness to criticism. And this sounds trivial, but if you look around, most people around us are preoccupied with showing that they were already on the right, even when you correct their mistakes. So they would say, you misunderstood me, let me rephrase what I meant earlier, and so on and so forth. So if you adopt seriously the idea that you have even I would say a moral obligation to be open to criticism, because it makes life better and it makes society better.
You just said it was a moral obligation. So
yes, he expressed himself like that. Yes. I once asked him whether we should be open to criticism, because being open is the good, or and yes, he replied that this is his. It's a direct quote of him. So he was even allowing a reformulation of his views in traditional terms. That the good is approached by the encouragement of openness to criticism, and this has application again in various fields, like for example, take education. Okay, so in education we have two major systems, as in epistemology, by the way. We have two attitudes towards truth. One is paternalism, the idea that my father knew already all the truth, and that my tradition represents the truth. And if you look around, every nation or a tribe or a super tribe believes that came out of paternalism, at least. Yes, the Japanese believe that they are descended from the gods, and the Chinese believe that they are their tradition is the best, and the Jews and the Muslims and so on and so forth. So this is one, I would say, epistemological attitude that is also characteristic of most of the history of philosophy. Most philosophers tried to show that they can prove either that the tradition that they came from is correct, or that their new reconstructed tradition is provable. So once you discover that your father may have been wrong, that your tradition may have contained errors, you immediately try correcting those errors, and you can be open about it or silent about it. But all traditions change. That's a matter of fact. So all traditions undergo a correction of errors, but they do so silently while maintaining that they do not change. So this is one idea of epistemological idea that you can find in a classroom, because in most classes throughout the world, still today, the teacher is the one knowing what he's talking about. And the students, or they could be children, they could be grown-ups, they somehow have to obey his leading his even commands, but I would say he's guiding them towards what he regards to be true. And the other epistemology is relativism, or wrongly titled pluralism, which says that all fathers are the strongest and the smartest, and they can each offer their children a truth, which, so long as they do not question it too much, can provide everything that is required in life of them. And I find that most systems that I took part in, including the one I teach in today, is vacillating or wavering or conflating sometimes these two approaches. So students are for example, the agenda or the syllabus that I mentioned earlier in the first course of Agassi is already set by me, because I know, and if we have an argument, usually I am the one deciding the argument because I know. Or otherwise, the student would have all kinds of relativistic defenses, dismissing my view as one view among many, and he has his own truth, or she has her own truth, and so on and so forth. Now, Agassi, I think, realized that first of all, in the field of epistemology, Popper introduced the third option. This is very important to stress. Neither paternalism nor relativism. We have a view that says, yes, there is one tradition that is true, but no one knows what it is, right? So it's not my father and not your father, and we have to criticize the traditions that each of us came with in order to try and mediate the best version of a fallible but not yet refuted tradition that we have. That's science, okay? So if we adopt this epistemological idea, the classroom should change immediately, because we have to admit that the teacher is not in the know anymore. So we have to take the power from the teacher, right? And it is also wrong to say that every student is right because every student comes from a different tradition.
So how much power do you take from the teacher? Sorry to interrupt.
Everything. That's what Agassi was practicing as a teacher. And he could even say, well, if there are no questions today, we will go home. You see?
But there is a certain moral point, certainly that it is important that, so at some point I read Agassi drawing a distinction between compulsory school and compulsory education, saying perhaps people should be forced to attend school, coerced, but not into what they actually learn within those schools.
Yes, but the coercion there was to enable the parents to go to work, because it was not for the sake of children. So yes, he did recommend that babysitting or state provided free babysitting would be a good idea.
How much of this theory, it's very psychological theory. How much of it is focused on the avoidance of suffering? At some point, I remember Agassi talking about compulsory education as imprisonment or something like that.
I would minimum security jails.
Yes.
That's his son's expression. But it's quite a correct one, I think. What was your question? How serious this model is, or what were your?
It's a psychological kind of question. So rather than it just be a good way to improve criticism in the world, is it also about reducing suffering in the world as well?
Oh, yes, reducing, yes. So, yes, the motive is reduction of suffering. And I think in this he was accepting Popper's only ethical comment that by defining suffering as something that should be avoided, we can start building an ethical structure. He says so specifically, and Agassi was taking it as a matter of course, and he was extremely sensitive to the suffering and loneliness of people who enthusiastically attempt to participate in debate and are being ignored by dogmatism or paternalism or a sense of hierarchy that they inadvertently ignore or are unaware of, and so on.
There's do you think Agassi's ideal classroom has ever existed or got close to existence? So in your interactions with Agassi, did you feel a hierarchy at all, or was that?
I can tell you that as a student, I often felt frustrated. Because there were a few times that I wanted him to teach me a certain logical system, for example, that he was, and he was, it was never on the table that I would sit as a student and he would give me a lecture, you know. It was never like that. It was always a conversation. So we are all conditioned, I would say, to paternalism by the upbringing that we all have. It's clear that we feel more secure in having the grown-ups tell us what to do and not what to do, and not being treated as autonomous beings, but clearly that's Agassi's model of what the ethical life would be, that we are all autonomous beings, and
I think I remember
to criticism.
Thinking back briefly to I had two very brief discussions with Agassi. He mentioned Socrates a lot. Do you think Socrates was the ideal teacher in Agassi's mind?
He was, but you have to remember first that Plato's Socrates is an improvement upon the historical Socrates. So Plato himself attests. And that Agassi had a few idols that I would say were slightly improved versions of what you would read in the text. So Socrates, the Socrates that Agassi admired was a slight improvement upon the Socrates that I read in Plato. Even. For example, a trivial example, Socrates was much more religious, clearly, than Agassi presents him. He presents him as a religious reformist, which is true, but I think he was a far smaller reformist in this sense than Agassi would allow.
This democratic, individualistic kind of education, it implies a tremendous faith in the individual itself and the abilities of the individual.
And that's perhaps even an exaggerated faith. It's a method that I never quite was able to push through with Agassi, although I tried many times. Because, for example, this is what Nathaniel Laor is criticizing also with Agassi's attitude towards both the mentally ill and the children. Because if you take kids, for example, you need protective laws. But for Agassi, it was like... No, there shouldn't be any laws, for example, forbidding drugs. Okay, so you could. It's clear that this is liberal. You could do whatever you want as a grown-up, but he would say there's no need even for protection laws for kids against this because kids don't take drugs unless the society around them is so sick that they would, and this would not happen if we had the liberal society that he recommended. So I think he was as liberal as you can get, and it is an open question whether we can get as liberal as he recommended. It's a very interesting challenge.
What does this philosophy imply about ourselves? So rather than education itself, but duties to yourself. I remember at one point Agassi talking about this kind of focus on autonomy and the importance of criticism also implies that we have certain duties to be kind to ourselves and give value to our own thoughts in a certain way. So how did you view that Agassi's ideas on that?
I think they all come in the service of learning from error. So if you are kinder to yourself, you will, by forgiving yourself, become more autonomous and more open to criticism. This is the aim of being kinder to ourselves. And if you are strict, you become defensive and dogmatic. So it's all in. So it's not like you would. Agassi was against the idea of a grand system. Okay, you could. He would mock people who know every answer in advance to any question. Whether they were swamis or rabbis or philosophers, and it was odd to him that the person would aspire to have this even because that would mean that he cannot learn anything new. So the idea of a partial system he saw as a result is resulting from critical rationalism. Having no system at all is, of course, impossible. No animal gets into the world without a preconception of the world, of course. But so the real trick is having as few guidelines as possible, but developing with their aid. And the one central guideline was learning from our errors, and this meant, or this implied things that, for example, kindness to ourselves that other Popperians did not conceive of. So it was by implementing this partial system, or the idea of reformism, the idea that we come to the world within a tradition and we reform it slowly and gradually, which also implies democracy. And so you do have a kind of a opening flower that seems to cover many fields. It's not a full system only in the sense that you would meet certain challenges and you would say, well, I haven't thought of that. This is new to me. And he would often say that when we were in conversation. Say, I need to think about that. Let me get back to you on this, and so on. So it was not like he was offering a coherent, contradiction-free philosophy of life, but he did have guidelines which the central is critical rationalism, that he was able to recognize within them much that you can, much of the philosophy that he produced later on.
Is this where his institutional individualism comes into this? Because
So
institutions affect the behavior of
individualism is a I don't know how much time we have, but institutional individualism is basically an answer to the question what elements should come in an explanation of a social fact, basically. Okay. So you have a social fact, a person goes from point A to point B in Seoul, okay? He doesn't go on a straight line, right? He goes about doing certain, obeying certain social institutions, such as, for example, traffic laws. Okay, cats and dogs cross the street from point A to point B in the straightest line. That's why they get run over. If you want to explain the behavior of people, Popper was guiding his students to reduce all the explanations to the motives of individual people. And the idea of institutional individualism is that you of course, individuals are the only acting agents in society. But if you want to explain their behavior, you must resort to institutions which are not reducible to just the beliefs of individuals. So I don't. You don't even need institutions here. You know, you can take a physical fact. Okay, let's say it rains for the next 10 years nonstop. Okay. This would change social life, right? So it was, if you wanted to explain social life as or the behavior of a certain person in 5 years from now, you would need more than the beliefs and motives of that individual person. You would need to mention the fact that it's raining all the time, and then mention the fact that since, say, he hates getting wet, he leaves home less than he used to when the sun was shining. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you need both the motives of the individual and the fact that it's raining. And certain institutions in the social sciences, they like kinship or the traffic laws that I mentioned, or universities, they direct our behavior by creating, if you want to return to the starting point, by creating a sort of a frame of possible options, right? So,
mm-hmm.
so you, for example, when you are a child, you are being asked, what do you want to do when you grow up? Okay. And the list of answers is already set by the society which you are in. In certain societies, it could be a hunter or a apple picker, or, you know, so the social institutions they function as would or as parts of the metaphysics that defines the worldview in which decisions are being made, and so it functions as part of the explanation. I hope I was clear enough.
Yeah, as you're talking, it segues really well into something you mentioned briefly earlier, which is, and it comes from Agassi's Ethics as well, and this is the question of mental illness. Now, Agassi wrote 2 books on mental illness and neurosis and paranoia and depression, and he had this, from what you've just said there, he had this very interesting idea about what is causing these things, and it's defective autonomy of the individual. So I might get you to explain that. Well,
first, his theory of paranoia was very different than the traditional one, or Freud's, because he was working with one of the best known psychiatrists in Israel at the time, and the main idea of the main view of psychosis was that it is an extreme threshold on a spectrum, where you have, say, the normal, the extremely neurotic, and then the psychotic. Okay, so there was a linear spectrum of the human behavior, and the core idea was that we are all a little bit neurotic, as Freud said, and we are all a little bit psychotic. And psychotic here means certain dogmatic glitches in our logical mode of arguing or understanding the world, I would say. So this was, I would say, their first contribution. And Agassi, to the best of my knowledge, did not speak about partial autonomy. I think this was not his contribution. Agassi, but he did speak about partial rationality with Javi, and it is open to question whether the two terms are coextensive. It's a open, interesting question. I'm not sure we can go down to the details of it, but Tversky and Kahneman received their Nobel Prize. Supposedly by discovering that we are less rational than the theories of economy suppose. And Agassi says, but we all knew that way before. He says, for example, I wrote with Javi the paper on the rationality of magic and so on. So he was not impressed with the ascription. Of course, he acknowledged the contribution of Tversky and Kahneman, but he said all they gave is new examples. Not they didn't teach us really a new principle. So for Agassi, that the idea that rationality is always partial because we are humans and we are being human. We don't think like computer programs. We have our biases and our emotions and so on, and our ties, our social ties. And the institutions which we participate in, and all of these lay restrictions on our ability to be rational. But it seems that he recommended that despite the fact that we are only and always partially rational, we should be treated, our decisions, we should be treated as autonomous. And what Laor, to my understanding, argued is that this is not the case in the extreme cases of people who might injure themselves or others. So it's open to debate, I would say, whether this is the same or not, because for Agassi there seems to be always an extremely liberal attitude, regardless of how irrational we are in fact, as if we not only should strive for this, but we should be treated as such. And Laor said, no, just as you would treat someone who fainted and lost his leg, and you wouldn't wake him to ask him whether to treat him or not, so a person at a certain severity of psychosis should have earned our attention and treatment.
So when you
this, yes, okay.
I was just going to say, so when someone does institutionalize a paranoiac or someone with neurosis against their will, it is a protection of their rights rather than a denial of their rights.
Exactly. That's the way Laor would put it.
And I'm assuming though that through Agassi's claims here, he's saying there is something defective gone wrong in the mind of the paranoiac. So I remember him writing somewhere that they are logical and they perceive the world quite well, but and of course they have certain abstract ideas, but things break down when they refuse to acknowledge that the public, the world beyond them, needs any translation of those ideas. So it's the criticism element that begins to fail them.
Yes, the criticism of their own thesis that everyone around them is trying to hurt them.
I must I'm conscious I'm running over time from what I promised you here, but I must ask you at least one last question or two about politics here, and Agassi's
Israeli
views.
Politics, you mean?
Yes, Israeli politics. Yes,
crying. What can I say? It's a tragedy. That's Agassi's analysis of the tragedy of Israeli politics is so accurate and so prophetic that all I can do is repeat it in a few sentences.
Okay.
So what he says basically is that Israel has declared himself, has been established as a non-modern nation state, because in a modern, normal nation state, the citizens are those who inhabit the space of the land, right? Mm-hmm. So, and in Israel, of course, it's not true, because it declares itself to be a Jewish state, and Jews, you can find Jews in Korea, that mm-hmm. They are in principle Israelis tomorrow, and mm-hmm. So by declaring an ethnic or a historical identity as the national identity, Israel has violated one of the basic rules of modern democracy. And so he said, unless it corrects this, which means that I would have an Israeli passport and not a Jewish, they call it Israeli, but in the Israeli passport, it says whether I'm Jewish or not Jewish. So it's a mess. I'm willing to.
So there are degrees of citizenship and naturalization.
Of course, there's apartheid is built in, and Israel was able to avoid blunt apartheid by very sophisticated legal means. But what's now happening is that all the legal system in Israel is being attacked by the politicians who are aiming to overthrow its democracy.
But Agassi was
so far succeeding.
I'm assuming that Agassi was a nationalist of a kind. He wasn't a cosmopolitan.
He was not a nationalist. He was willing to accept that this is the way the world is being run. He didn't have nationalistic feelings or sentiments, but he says, I am aware that most of the people around me do have them, and so since they do have them, we have to abide by their wish to institutionalize these sentiments. So it's true that he was not as cosmopolitan as Popper was, in the sense that he believed the idea of a nation state silly, but he was very, very close to this idea, in that he thought, well, whether it's silly or not, we have to indulge it because people around us do.
So perhaps the idea of civic nationalism is the best approximation of cosmopolitanism that you can find.
I would say he said civic nationalism is a prerequisite for democracy, and democracy is the closest we have to the open society. And Israel is going the other way. There is little doubt about that.
Well, on that, I should ask you a last question or so about Agassi in general here. What do you think, and of course this is going to be a very hard question to answer, what do you think his legacy is going to be? I've heard many people speak about him and say things like he illuminated many of Popper's ideas, or the differences between him and Popper were very minor and just difference of emphasis. And some people have said there's huge distinctions between him and Popper. And how do you see Agassi's continuing legacy into the years ahead?
Well, this depends on you and me. This really depends on
I'll change the question. How would you like to see Agassi's legacy? How would you like to have him and his philosophy be understood and remembered?
I think he would want to be remembered as respectful critic of his teacher, and someone who implemented his teacher's ideas in fields that his teacher did not even dream of.
And last point, what do you think was his greatest philosophical contribution? He wrote so widely on so many things. Which one do you think is his greatest contribution? Or his most important one?
I would say his most important effect was as a teacher, an educator. His personality and of those that were able to work alongside him and with him was a true inspiration and a life-changing experience.
And that is a great note to end the podcast on as well.
Thank you very much.
Well, below the podcast, I will link some of your academic pages, Nimrod, as well as some of the places you can find your books. But I'm also going to link Agassi's personal website and places where people can find Agassi's work as well.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure.
My pleasure.